Blog Talk Radio.
Hello and welcome to the Razor Swift. I'm your host, Rich Christian. Today we'll be talking Cold Case Christianity with our guest, J. Warner Wallace. He is the author of the new book, Cold Case Christianity, which is dealing with the resurrection of Christ. J. Warner Wallace is a cold case homicide detective, a mission leader, and a church planter. As a result of his work with cold cases, Wallace has been featured on numerous television programs, including Dateline, Fox News, and Court TV. Wallace's visual presentations in the courtroom have revolutionized how capital offense trials are presented in Los Angeles County and across the country. A vocal atheist for many years, Wallace is now an apologist for Christianity with a master's degree in theology and the founder of the Please Convince Me blog, PleaseConvinceMe.com blog and podcast. He and his wife, Susie, have 4 children and live in Southern California. So without further ado, let's bring on J. Warner Wallace. Are you there, sir?
I am. Thanks for having me, Rich. I appreciate you putting me on the show.
Excellent. Well, thank you for coming on the show here. So for those that don't know who you are, can you give us a little bit of background about yourself before we get into today's topic?
Well, I'm just a guy who kind of came up in Southern California, was born and raised here. My dad was a police officer back in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and I kind of followed in his footsteps. I wasn't intending to. I actually started off in the arts, and I got my bachelor's in design and my master's in architecture before I came over to the police department about 27, and been working there for 25 years. And along the way, I got a chance to do some kind of interesting assignments and ended up ultimately working cold cases. We have a homicide team that works in our city, is responsible for every active homicide, every current homicide. But we also had a bunch of unsolved cases going back to like 1970-ish, right around that area, and we started kind of working them collaterally, and over a period of time, the agency said, we're having some success. We can see how we could have even more success if we started a full team. And, we started that, I think, around 2006 or 5 or 6 or 7, right in that range, because we were always working these cases on the side. But eventually they kind of released us, a pair of us, to work them full-time, and I've been doing that ever since. And so I've been, I think, working cold cases now for about 12 years, and I've really enjoyed it, but I learned a lot along the way. I wasn't always a Christian. I became a Christian at 35. So I've kind of taken some of the investigative principles and approaches that I learned on the job, and I've applied them in my own search for what happened 2,000 years ago in the case of Jesus.
That's a very interesting perspective that you have, and I remember I stumbled across you a number of months ago, and I think originally I heard about you on Greg Kokel's program on Stand to Reason, one of my favorite ministries, and I know that you're a guest host there at time to time, I guess when Greg is gone, but yeah, I know a lot of people want to say that it's all just a crapshoot with the resurrection, a bunch of jumbled facts and nothing really fits. But you as a detective, I think that's very fascinating and something that we can really take to the bank. That I'm looking forward to get into with you tonight.
Awesome.
So with now you said you were a vocal atheist. How many years was it? 30 some years?
Yeah, I was. I was raised by parents who had some. My dad was a kind of passive atheist, not passive, but happy atheist, I would say, in the sense that he was content in his atheism, still is. He doesn't object to people in his family going to church or holding beliefs, religious beliefs. In fact, I think he thinks in some ways it's a kind of a helpful delusion. It's a useful tool to help kids learn how to behave and learn certain values that he actually respects. But he's not a believer. And my mom was more of a, at least when I was younger, more of a kind of cultural Catholic. I think she's more involved now in her beliefs. But I think that when I was growing up, we were kind of like the holiday Catholics who might go to Mass on certain occasions, but not all that often. So I got a chance to have put one foot in the Catholic Church and experience what she saw. And after she divorced, in the 60s, quite frankly, the church wasn't all that kind to her in terms of what it will allow a divorced woman to do in terms of the sacraments, the way she was treated at that period of time. I was always convinced from a very early age that this was really kind of a fruitless work of man. I didn't believe that God existed, and certainly if there was a God, I could not believe that any of these systems, at least the ones I had experienced as a child, could properly reflect his existence. I just didn't buy it. Mm-hmm. And I think also, those of us who were raised in that 60s Star Trek generation, I think we always had hope and really saw that science started to kind of give us a snapshot or a peek at answering some of life's big questions. And I was just content that science would have an answer and had an answer for everything that religious people would go to God for. So I just never felt, and I think I describe myself as angry only because my dad has used that term with me, but I never really saw myself that angry. I mean, I guess I was very impatient with people who didn't have a healthy respect for evidence. And so if you came to me as a believer who really couldn't defend evidentially why you believe something, that to me was, especially if you're a cop and you're saying, well, I believe in God and you don't have a good evidential reason to believe in God, I don't have any patience for that. And I guess that more than I'd like to admit, that appeared in my behavior or my demeanor with people around me, at least enough where people were noticing it. So I guess, and I'm not proud of that, but I could say that I was probably an impatient evidentialist,
Now, moving into this, being a detective, I know there's different steps that you take on any particular case. What are some of these steps that you go systematically here?
Well, I think you have to have a certain set of foundational guiding principles, and so you have to have a certain understanding of how evidence works. What's the nature of evidence? How does evidence come together to make a case? What are some of the presuppositions you have to be careful about? What's the nature of circumstantial evidence as compared to direct evidence? These are the kinds of things I try to teach in the book because I think they have a real bearing on how we see the evidence for Jesus from the first century. And I think a lot of misconceptions about evidence are held by lots of folks, believers and non-believers alike. And so I try to clear some of those up. And so instead of taking like a how-to, here's the 10 steps I take from the beginning of a case to the end, I've tried to give a set of 10 abiding principles related to investigations and evidence that people then can apply to any investigation of claims of religious claims or claims related to, what your kids will say they did last weekend when you were gone on a trip and you're trying to figure out what they were doing. So, I mean, these are all kind of simple principles of evidence that can be used. I just find that they're really helpful in making the case for Christianity because, like a cold case, we have these events in the distant past. My cases range from about 1979 to about 88 was the most recent case I've done. And so there are events in the distant past. We've got no living eyewitnesses who can testify directly to what happened in terms of, I saw this suspect do something. We have very little forensic evidence usually. So we're building these cases circumstantially. And how we build the case and present it to a jury is much like how you would investigate any case involving an event in the distant past for which you have no living eyewitnesses and not a lot of forensic evidence. And that just happens to be the claim of the situation that Christianity finds itself in. It's an event that we have no living eyewitnesses for, and we've got to make this case by piecing together the circumstantial evidence in much the same way we would piece it together for a cold case. So I think the skill set does apply, kind of transfers. The question, of course, is do people understand the nature of evidence? We see a lot of pushback right now, right, from people like Dawkins and Sam Harris and when Christopher Hitchens was alive, people would say that, hey, you folks irrationally believe something for which you have no supporting evidence. And I get so tired of hearing that because I guess on the basis of what they would consider to be supporting evidence, they'd have to say that every case I've ever worked, and we haven't lost one in front of a jury yet, has been a case for which we had no supporting evidence if that's the standard of evidence they're looking for. But it turns out that we do have more than enough evidence to make these cases, and I think we have more than enough evidence to make the case for Christianity.
Right. Now, I heard you say, I was watching your video series on your YouTube earlier today, Cold Case Resurrection, a three-part series, and you said that people exclude the very thing that they're looking for. And,
yes,
of course, that would be – go ahead.
That's exactly right. That's the first principle I try to teach in the book, is you can't be a know-it-all in the sense that you can't come in with some presupposition that then drives you in a particular direction to a conclusion at the exclusion of all kinds of other good evidence. So the example I try to give is one that I actually experienced, where we had a case that when we first walked in the room, there were some good evidential reasons. I mean, we looked at the evidence we had in the room, and one of the senior guys, who I really respect, and I was a very new detective at the time. I was just trying not to make sure I didn't step on the evidence that's on the floor. I was just trying to be careful in the scene. And he came to a quick conclusion. He said, "We got to find the husband. The husband did this." And I can tell you that the nature of the room was such that I could see why he would come to that conclusion. He's worked a lot of murders, and in a lot of these situations that look just like this, a woman dead on her bed, clothes missing from the closet, a picture of her on the nightstand with a man about her age. I mean, who is this guy? Well, I want to find this guy. If she's married, I want to find her husband, because 99% of the time, that's who killed her. But if you walk in with that presupposition, you'll start to see every piece of evidence in the room and imagine it supporting your conclusion, because you started with this conclusion. And it turned out, yes, there were some pieces of evidence in the room that you could interpret as, driving you toward this conclusion. But it turned out that it wasn't her husband at all. She wasn't even married. It was a neighbor who had done this. And, of course, once we kind of put those together, those pieces, all the evidence in the room fit perfectly with that conclusion. What was driving us initially was simply that we had a presupposition. The husband did it. And it colored the way we looked at every piece of evidence in the room. And I think that as a non-believer, I had a presupposition called philosophical naturalism, which basically says, hey, I don't believe in any supernatural explanation. So if you're going to do history, please don't include supernatural events. Those don't occur. If you're going to do science, please don't include supernatural explanations. Those are out of bounds. I was a philosophical naturalist. So here I am investigating the crime. Does God exist? Does something supernatural, God, exist? Yet I started off with a presupposition which said that nothing supernatural can exist. So naturally, I get the same conclusion every time I look, because I've started off with a presupposition which colors the way I look at every piece of evidence. And, let's face it, in every trial I've ever had, the prosecution and the defense are using the exact same set of evidences with the jury. The prosecution is going to argue that these evidences lead to one kind of inference. The defense is going to argue they lead to a different kind of inference, but they're using the exact same pieces of evidence. So it's quite possible, if we're not careful, to allow the evidence to kind of lean you one direction or the other, because you have a presupposition in that direction. And that's true for Christians. That's true for non-believers. And we have to do our best to try to kind of walk into the room with empty hands. Don't walk in with a bias, with a presupposition that forces you in a particular direction. And that includes the presupposition of philosophical naturalism.
Right, and I've heard men like Bart Ehrman say the same thing, that as a historian we can only record history, but yet if it's part of history, regardless if it's naturalism or the supernatural, history is history. And I think it was him with was it William Lane Craig that he said that in one of his debates?
Well, he also said it, I even quote it in the book on a show called Unbelievable. Justin Brierley's got a show in the UK called Unbelievable, where he puts a believer and a non-believer on the show for an hour each week, discussing a key issue of debate. It's a very nice show, a very good show in the sense that the demeanor of each person is typically extremely congenial. It's a very carefully delivered debate between two sides. And once Ehrman was on with Mike Licona, and they were talking about this very issue. And Bart made a very clear statement, which is the position of many philosophical naturalists, that if you see a description of something in history that includes something supernatural, it is now an account that has moved from history into mythology. So he would say you have to recategorize this thing. It's not history anymore. It's mythology, because the presence of the supernatural is the thing that drives it. But what if the supernatural explanation ends up being the best inference from evidence? If we just look, every explanation in a case that I've ever worked has got some liability. Even the true explanation can have a liability in court, because you may not be able to answer certain questions. You don't have enough eyewitnesses to answer how did he get rid of the body? How did he park her car over there and get back in time? Lots of questions that aren't answered, and those are the liabilities, even for the case which represents the truth. Well, it turns out that the Christian story does have a liability. The liability is not that it can't answer all the pieces of evidence. It does, but the problem is it requires a resurrection to be possible in the first place. That's the liability. It requires the supernatural to be true, to be possible, to be reasonable. And that's where I think we have to admit that our story has a liability. But if we simply put down our presuppositions against the supernatural, there are no liabilities. The liabilities are really all in that one bag.
Yeah. Well, here's something I'm always curious about. Evidence and proof. Some people use those terms interchangeably, and I don't quite think they are. Isn't proof made up of evidence and a cumulative case of evidence?
I agree with you. I think you're absolutely spot on. I think that people do use that term interchangeably, and it never should be used that way. I mean, I very seldom will ever. I mean, I just don't do it anymore. I think when I was younger, I might have used this expression, but I don't say to people, "Hey, I'm going to prove this to you." No, I'm going to give you the reasons why I believe it's true evidentially. I'm going to give you the reasons that drove me to the conclusion that this was the best answer evidentially, or the best, most reasonable inference from the evidence. But I don't say, I'm going to prove this to you, because all I can do is present the evidence as I see it. And this may prove something to you, or it may not, because the thing that you have to, the chasm you have to kind of bridge in order to turn the evidence into proof is going to involve a lot of things. It's not just evidential. I mean, it's not just evidence that people think they need. Some people are resisting the truth for rational reasons. Some people resist it for emotional reasons. Some people resist it for volitional reasons. There are many reasons why people will say, hey, I don't care what that evidence is. I don't believe it. And I wish it was true, Rich, that everyone that we talk to, it really just needs more evidence. You know, I just don't get it. It doesn't make sense to me evidentially, but a lot of times there are other issues involved which keep people from seeing the evidence conclusively so that it proves something to them. And so I think you're right. We use evidence to make a case. We can do that, but whether it's proof or not, that's in the mind of the beholder, or that's in the mind of the evaluator. Mm-hmm. Does my evaluation of this evidence get me to a place where I am beyond a reasonable doubt, where I have what I call evidential sufficiency? I'm there now. I get it. I believe it happened this way. And so that person can then say it's been proven to me. But our job is to present the evidence as it is and help people understand the levels of evidence we're looking at and what's the standard of proof, and to help people understand how evidence works together. And then they'll look at this case and make a decision for themselves. Mm-hmm. But I wish it was just rational doubt that people have, or rational resistance. I call it the 3 reasons why anyone would shun the truth. It's rational, emotional, or volitional. And unfortunately, only one of those 3 do we really have the clearest ability to kind of resolve in a quick conversation. We can provide evidence, but can I really deal with the history of a person's background that's given them some emotional reason to reject Christianity? Maybe their father was a Christian and they have a bad relationship with their father. They have an emotional reason to reject it. Or maybe they just enjoy being God themselves. Why would they want to stop being God to embrace my God? It's a volitional issue. There's lots of reasons why people reject the truth. Mm-hmm. So we have to kind of consider those in total.
Okay. Definitely want to get into discussing some of the issues of the Gospels here in just a moment. But one more question about evidence. Of course, the skeptics always want empirical evidence. And, of course, you as a detective deal with circumstantial evidence. Of course, circumstantial is enough to convict or acquit. And so why is it always empirical that they want of these of things dealing with the resurrection or God or whatever, but yet other things, a lot of sciences, unless you're dealing with mathematics or deductive logic, stuff like that, there's still enough room for there is doubt, and there's not 100% proof. So that would still not be empirical, right?
Right. I think it's important for us to use the language that puts the categories of evidence into 2 boxes so people can understand them. And it's not so much empirical that defies, because there can be empirical evidence that's circumstantial. It's really about, is the evidence circumstantial, or is it direct? Sometimes circumstantial is called indirect or non-direct evidence. And the idea here is circumstantial. Well, let me give you an illustration of this. If I go outside and see that, let's put it this way. The 2 kinds of evidence we have in trials, it'd be nice if I had somebody who could actually say, I saw your defendant do this murder. I was there that day. I've known this guy, the defendant, for 25 years. He spoke to me that morning. He spoke to me right before the murder. He was wearing a shirt that I recognized him wearing many, many times before. As a matter of fact, I gave him that shirt many years ago on a holiday. And that day he came up to me and spoke to me, and I saw him leave me at my presence and walk across the street and do this murder. Wow. That's a piece of direct evidence. You've got an eyewitness who can testify directly to what they saw this defendant do. And if you are satisfied that they're not mistaken about his identity, he said they know the shirt he gave him, they spoke with him right beforehand, you've got good reason to believe you've got a direct piece of evidence there. Wow, that's one person in trial. With that one statement, if you believe that witness, you can convict that guy on that one piece of evidence, the direct testimony of an eyewitness. But everything else is circumstantial. And I often say, well, people will think, well, DNA, that's scientific. Well, not really. I mean, if I've got the suspect's DNA on my victim's body, but then I get him into court and he says, and it comes out in testimony that, well, he's had a 2-year relationship with this woman. He sleeps with her every night. Of course his DNA is. The circumstance now has mitigated the power of that DNA evidence on her body. So it turns out that scientific empirical evidence really has to be in the right circumstance. If he said, hey, I don't know this woman, I've never seen her before, I've never been in her house, and then you find his DNA on her body, now you've got something very compelling. But the circumstance will dictate the value of that scientific evidence, won't it? So everything really, with the exception of eyewitness testimony, is circumstantial. And so when we get into court, we're going to make a case that the circumstances are going to dictate the power of each piece. And circumstantial cases require us to assemble cumulatively lots of pieces. The more pieces we have that point to the same conclusion, the more powerful the case. And when I do these talks around the country, I spend time showing how you can build a case against a suspect with just 8 pieces of circumstantial evidence. Usually by the time I'm maybe 4 or 5 pieces in, people are ready to convict this guy, and they've done it with nothing but 4 or 5 pieces of circumstantial evidence. So this is why judges around the nation instruct juries to not denigrate, to not devalue circumstantial evidence compared to direct evidence. They're to be given the exact same value. And I can tell you, the great thing about circumstantial evidence, Rich, is that it doesn't lie to you intentionally. Witnesses sometimes do. Mm-hmm. But circumstantial evidence has to be inferred. You have to take a look at it and evaluate it yourself. Now, you can misunderstand it. You could come to the wrong conclusion. But it's not going to intentionally try to deceive you, and that is often the case with witnesses. So the first part of the book talks about different properties of evidence. The second part of the book really evaluates the claims of the Gospels to see if the authors are really trying to intentionally deceive us with what they're saying. And there are ways to evaluate witnesses to see if they are being deceptive, and that's one of the tool sets I want to give people as they read through the Gospels.
Okay. That's a great interlude here, because I was going to ask you about the Gospels, and I know people, this is one of the things that skeptics use is the discrepancies amongst the 4 Gospels.
Right.
You know, they say, well, one Gospel says there was 2 men or 1 man, and the other one says no, there wasn't any, or, you know, the angels, and there's all these different things that they want to bring up. And
sure.
I think I remember you saying it even on Stand to Reason. You're saying that the fact that there are discrepancies shows that there's not collusion.
Yeah, and I think that's something that a lot of folks, I know Greg, we'll talk about it on Stand to Reason too, and my experience, though, has honestly reflected this reality. So it's not just that this is a kind of philosophically and in principle reasonable, but it's that it's practically my experience each and every time I've worked a case of any magnitude. I don't care if it's a burglary, up to a robbery, up to a murder. If you've got more than one witness, these 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses or 5 witnesses are not going to tell you precisely the same thing, even when they've been present in the same room in which it occurred, even if they're standing right next to each other and watching the event simultaneously. We tell patrol officers when they get to a scene of a crime, please immediately separate the witnesses, because if you don't, and I get there an hour later and they haven't been separated, we lose stuff, because people will be talking to each other, and they'll either talk each other out of certain observations when maybe they're right, and the nuances aren't clear to them. They will be to us later as the investigator. I want every messy description of the event I can get. I don't worry about lining things up and making it all sweet and making it all perfect so it all goes down like butter. I want this to be as messy as it can be, because in that mess, the truth is lies. And I think that when you realize that no crime has ever been observed by multiple eyewitnesses and described in precisely the same way, you realize that the same thing is happening in the Gospels. And you've got to ask the witnesses, and ask yourself when evaluating these witnesses as a detective, is somebody wrong here? Or is it something in the perspective of the witness that has caused them to describe it or see it in a particular way? Not just in the physical perspective of the witness, where is he standing in the room, but in the this person's background. I've done cases where a witness has a particular experience. Sometimes it's just with a piece of clothing. This witness knows the shirt on the suspect better than anybody else, because right away she recognized that shirt was the same shirt she bought, her husband two nights ago. And so for some period of time she was just kind of looking at the shirt on the guy and kind of fixed on that, and she's able to provide us with some details as a result of that experience, but she misses other details because she's too fixed on one issue. And you see all of these things come into bear when you are dealing with eyewitnesses. People bring all kinds of baggage into the crime scene with them, and they will notice things at a heightened sense, and they will miss other things based on their background coming into the crime scene. And I have to kind of sit back and say, well, is she wrong? She missed this altogether. Was there a car? She didn't even describe a car. She actually thinks he ran out and ran through the parking lot. Yeah, I've got this guy saying, no, he ran right to 10 feet to a car and got in a car and drove off. Now, who's right and who's wrong here, and why might she see it this way and he see it the other way? I've got to work through those issues. Now, let me say something controversial that sometimes people, I think, misunderstand. I do not need, as an investigator, an inerrant set of eyewitness accounts. What I need is a reliable set of eyewitness accounts. Now, as a Christian, I believe that God's Word is inerrant, but that's a standard I don't need in order to trust the accounts. What I need instead is reliability. And I can tell you that reliable eyewitnesses in a court of law are often wrong, and the judge will instruct jurors that, hey, you know what, it might be wrong about some piece of this account, but you can evaluate it and say, is there a reason why she might be wrong on that piece, but be correct about everything else? You get to evaluate the error that you might find. Now, I look at the Scriptures, and I don't see it this way at all. I think we've got a very reliable set of accounts. I think the bar is actually much lower in order to trust the Gospels than what we actually have. Because what I'm looking for in eyewitness accounts is reliability, not inerrancy.
Well, here's a question about eyewitnesses as a whole. Of course, this is another thing I've heard a lot from skeptics. They say that, eyewitnesses aren't that reliable at all. So, when the Gospels talk about what there was 500 that saw, and other people, and they say, well, that doesn't really matter because eyewitnesses, they change their stories. So, I know you've kind of already talked about some of that already, but how do you, I guess, percentage, I don't know if we can even say percentage-wise, but,
right. Well, I think we would be foolish to say when an eyewitness comes in, if the eyewitness says it happens, it's done. Instead, what we do is we give jurors a list. In California, there's a list of questions. Now, the jurors aren't going to actually be able to ask these questions of the witnesses, but they're able to they're instructed to consider these kinds of questions when listening to eyewitness statements. In other words, put the eyewitnesses to a test. And it turns out the test is broadly broken into four major categories. Number one, were they really present? Two, were they, is there some way to corroborate what they're saying? Either another eyewitness or some piece of physical evidence. Three, are they accurate? Has their testimony been changed in some way? Have they changed it over the years? Are they just wrong, or are they lying to you? And four, do they have some bias that would cause them to want to lie to you to achieve some evil end? So these are the four ways we evaluate eyewitnesses. And I think because we use this technique of evaluating the eyewitnesses, that's how we eliminate those eyewitnesses we can't trust. So to say that you can't trust eyewitness testimony, it's unreliable, well, this is why we test eyewitnesses in courtrooms. This is why we have jurors. If you had to just throw out every eyewitness that ever came into a courtroom, you'd be in pretty sad shape. Instead, we say, look, eyewitnesses can be wrong. Therefore, jurors, test the eyewitnesses in these ways. If they pass those tests, or at least if you don't find anything that would exclude them as reliable, then you may consider them reliable. But here's another important issue. In courtrooms, jurors are encouraged to consider the eyewitness reliable unless they find fault in one of these areas. Don't come in and distrust all these eyewitnesses. You can consider them reliable, but put them to the test, and if they don't pass the test, then you can exclude their testimony. So what I tried to do in the second half of the book is say, hey, I'm not stupid. I wouldn't just trust these eyewitnesses off the top of my head. Instead, I want us to test these eyewitnesses. Here's the 4 criteria. Let's see if they pass the test in these 4 criteria.
So what about the disciples themselves when people say they were just delusional or they hallucinated, that people say that they saw an apparition or whatever and it really wasn't the resurrected Jesus? How do you deal with that charge?
Well, I think that lots of good work has been done, and I don't think I can bring better resources to the table than say someone like Licona and Habermas, who have written this kind of minimal facts approach to looking at the resurrection. That I think that's very similar to what we do in investigations. We use something called deductive reasoning, and we just walk in the room and we say, okay, what's the evidence in the room? Let's make a list of it. Now let's say, okay, what are the possible explanations? Let's make a list of the possible explanations. Now let's take a look at the evidence in light of these possible explanations and see if any of the possible explanations is actually the best and most reasonable given the evidence that's in the room. That's what we do every day. And we do that even when we walk in and we're not sure if we got a homicide. You can have a death scene that's not necessarily a homicide. It could be a suicide. It could be a natural, or it could be an accidental. There are other ways that people die. We've got to look at the evidence in the room and say which of the 4 possible explanations for death is most reasonable given this evidence. Okay. Doing the same thing with the resurrection, we simply say what are the least arguable pieces of evidence in the room. The empty tomb. I mean, if the tomb was that shouldn't be all that controversial. If the tomb is not, if they could have produced a body in the tomb, the story of Jesus would have died 2,000 years ago, because the empty tomb is part of the dilemma that the naysayers have to deal with. So we looked at some of the very minimal pieces of evidence, the changed lives of the people who first claimed to see Jesus resurrected. Doesn't mean he was resurrected, just that these folks definitely had a changed life afterward. So we look at these very minimal pieces of evidence that are in the room, and then I listed all the possible explanations for how you might possibly explain these minimal pieces of evidence, including, of course, the Christian explanation, which is that he simply rose from the dead. But there are lots of other possible explanations. They lied about it. They were delusional. Somebody had a vision and convinced the others. Someone posed as an imposter. There's lots of different possibilities. But all the possibilities, including the Christian one, have liabilities. And I think the liabilities are numerous for all the other possibilities and are singular for the Christian explanation. The Christian explanation does have a liability, but it's singular. Is a resurrection possible in the first place? And that's the liability of the Christian explanation. It requires a supernatural explanation. And the other ones, though, have numerous liabilities in ways in which they seem to fail the kind of basic evidential test we would give these explanations. That's one of the things. I have a very brief account of that in Scripture. But I'm really more focused on, can we trust? Now, look, if we can trust what the gospel writers are saying about Jesus, we're stuck with the Jesus who, from the very earliest accounts, is a miracle worker who claimed to be God and rose from the dead. And if this is the case, we have to kind of deal with Jesus in that light. We can't recreate him in our own mind to be a great teacher who wasn't really God. And, if that's the case, and he was a story that kind of evolved over time, we need to know that now so we can stop calling ourselves Christians. I think the evidence is very good, and I try to demonstrate it in the second half of the book, that the story of Jesus is verifiable, it's early, it's attested, it's transmitted faithfully, all the things we would hope in a cold case.
Well, let me back up just for a moment. Now, you started to go into, you talked about the 4 minimal facts that Habermas uses, and you named one of them was empty tomb. What are the other 3?
Well, I think that Habermas actually has a much, larger number of facts that I would even accept as a skeptic that I was. I mean, my description of I was probably a little more limiting in what I would say would be the facts that I would even consider to be under dispute. Here's what Habermas and Licona did. They basically did a survey of what is the scholarship related to Jesus, and is there some kind of common understanding. Lots of facts, I'm sure, they would say, are going to be contested by more liberal scholars or more skeptical scholars. Other facts will be embraced by, even the most skeptical of scholars. And so they looked at this and said, okay, let's make a list of all those evidences that are, for the most part, not under that much dispute. And let's see what that minimal list would look like. It wouldn't include some of the stuff that the most conservative scholars would list, but it would include, other more general pieces of evidence that would be accepted by almost anybody. Does that make sense? So this is what they call the minimal facts approach. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of came at it a little bit differently. I would have said these four pieces of evidence I could accept as the most minimal pieces of evidence. One, that Jesus did die on a cross and was buried. That's a piece that some doubters would say, I don't believe that Jesus even ever lived. But I think as we kind of go, I've written 3 articles on that on Please Convince Me. I think the idea that Jesus never lived and is a recreation of prior mythologies is just such a stretch that really no serious scholar, even Bart Ehrman just wrote a web book, like a Kindle book, on which he's arguing for the historicity of Jesus. So even a skeptic like Bart Ehrman is not going to deny the historicity of Jesus. So that's a minimal fact that I think we can at least start with. How about this? The fact that Jesus' tomb was empty and that no one ever produced his body. That's a very simple, minimal fact. Clearly we have no one in history who ever claimed to produce the body of Jesus. The third fact I think is probably not under much debate is that Jesus' disciples, they believed that they saw Jesus resurrected from the dead. It doesn't mean he really was resurrected from the dead. It just means that the disciples believed that they saw him resurrected. Simple claim. I think it's a pretty standard claim, and it's a very minimal claim. And then finally, that Jesus' disciples were transformed after having this alleged resurrection observation. And this is a claim that you see, in Paul, the life he lived before as Saul, and having experienced the resurrected Christ, he's transformed. James, the brother of Jesus, clearly a skeptic in the Gospels, then becomes the leader of the largest Christian group in Jerusalem. As the leader of that church, you see some transformation. You also see incredible boldness in the early disciples, from Peter, who's the denier 3 times, to Peter, who is the leader of the church. You see a lot of transformation in terms of just the courage of these folks. So those are the 4. How do we explain those 4 minimal facts? And I think that there are a number of explanations that can be offered. I just think that if you can put down your presupposition against the supernatural, the Christian explanation has the least number of liabilities.
Something that I've heard so many times. Of course, a lot of these, they're regurgitated over and over. It seems like every generation kind of brings it back, and pun intended, they resurrect it.
Yeah, okay.
But I've heard a lot that they say that the Romans or secular sources did not record anything of the resurrection, or really even much about Jesus. And of course, there are the Jesus mythers, which at times I don't even want to talk to. It's so ridiculous that It's like, do I want to play into your buffooneries? But what do you say to the skeptic or the people that say that it was only written by his followers? Therefore, if it was such an event, then why wasn't it written by the Romans and other people groups that had a lot of records at that time period?
Yeah, I would think that, well, first of all, that the idea that there's a deep writing on the part of the Roman historians related to the minority groups within their kingdom and their belief systems is just not true. The idea that we have some evidential, to even argue that I need to have a non-Christian source for this information before I could ever trust it, I think is fallacious. I think it's a bad approach, and I'll tell you why. Let me give you a scenario. I actually had a case like this where a bank robber goes into a bank to do a robbery, and as he's waiting in line, the assistant manager sitting behind the desk recognizes the bank robber as somebody she went to high school with. She wanted to get up and say hello to him, didn't know he was going to rob a bank. He just thought he was a customer coming in the bank, and she didn't get a chance to get up to him before he got to the teller. And then as he gets to the teller, he slips her a demand note, shows a gun, and is now doing a robbery. And it's clear to the assistant manager, oh my gosh, he's doing a robbery. She can see it on the expression of the teller. And so now she's like shocked because this is somebody she went to high school with, and now she realizes he's a bank robber. As he leaves, they push the button, we respond. Now I have a witness, two witnesses, the bank teller and the assistant manager. But why should I trust what the assistant manager is telling me? She believes this guy is a bank robber. You might say she's a bank robber, and she's somebody who believes that guy was a bank robber. Do I need somebody who does not believe in his identity as a bank robber in order to find out if he's a bank robber? Do you see how silly this is? Mm-hmm. She didn't believe he was a bank robber when he first walked in. It was as a result of seeing him do a bank robbery that she became a believer. And now she's reliable. I can trust her, even though she has she has an opinion. She has a belief in his being a bank robber. But it's not that she started with that belief. She only came to that conclusion after watching him do a bank robbery. So to say that I can't trust the Gospels because they're written by Christians is silly. You think Matthew was a Christian before he observed everything that Jesus did and said? Matthew was a tax collector. He became a Christian as a result of watching what Jesus did. He didn't start off with a bias. He ended up with a conclusion, and that's the difference. So what happens is people will say, well, I can't trust I got to have a non-Christian source for this. Well, here's the problem. The non-Christians who watched Jesus and ended up writing Gospels, they became Christians as a result of what they saw. They started off as non-Christians. They ended up as Christians. If you're looking for a non-Christian source, these are non-Christian sources. At least the people who wrote them at one time were non-Christians. They only became Christians as a result of what they saw. So I think we have to kind of, number one, evaluate the Gospels on the merit of the Gospels and not throw them out because they happen to be written by authors who became Christians after seeing what Jesus did. That's a silly way to start, I think. But more importantly, there are, Tacitus, when he writes about the burning of Rome, he does talk about the mysterious kind of superstition that the Christians believed in that had been quelled for the moment, had been vanquished for the moment. Well, what is this superstition he's talking about? I mean, if you look at the context of his statement, I think it's very reasonable to conclude he's talking about this superstition related to the resurrection that has been squelched for the moment in Rome, where he says everything that's bad and perverse rises at some point. So I think that there is reference to, and even if you look at Phlegon's, as he's quoted by Origen, and he talks about Phlegon's writing, I think you'll see some discussion of the resurrected Jesus and showing his injuries to his believers. So you have to kind of evaluate each one of these. And I can tell you that skeptics are going to find a way to disqualify Tacitus, to disqualify Thallus, to disqualify all kinds of other folks. First of all, they'll say, hey, you don't have any of the original writings of these ancient authors. All you have are Christians who are quoting them. But if you look at the Christian quotes of these ancient authors, the Christians are not quoting them favorably. They're saying, hey, he's wrong. Thallus is wrong. Thallus thought that darkness of the crucifixion was just in a solar eclipse. He's wrong. Well, if he's going to lie about what Thallus said, I suppose you should probably just lie and have him agree with the Christian account. But when you see somebody who is arguing that account is false, I think it gives me more confidence that he's quoting it correctly because he's arguing about it. So,
yeah, I've heard people. I'm going to say this real quick, and we got to get to a break here. We have a 2-minute break coming up.
Okay.
I think they even play on the choice of words that Tacitus uses. Like just Christus, was it CHR? I forgot how to spell like TUSC.
Yes. I've seen it spelled a couple different ways. And so again, though, when we make circumstantial cases, we make them on the cumulative body of the work. So as we see the description that's offered of this guy they're calling Christus or Crestus, when they see the description of this guy, the description happens to match the features of Jesus as well as the name. So you could certainly take any one description out of the assembled case and argue that you've misinterpreted it. And that's exactly what defense attorneys do. If I've got 10 pieces of evidence that point to the same conclusion, they want to pick those off one at a time. So you have to look back at it and say, wow, this is just the unluckiest guy in the world. He's got 10 pieces of evidence that just coincidentally all seem to point to him. Or is it more reasonable that he's just the reason, he's the killer? He's got these evidences pointing to him because that's the proper conclusion. I think something similar happens with the writings of these ancient authors. Look at the entire body of what they're saying about this ancient figure, who they're calling the Christus. and the nature of the followers, and the nature of all these other things called Christians. And if you look at that, I think it's pretty silly to conclude it's anybody other than Jesus.
Right. Well, hey, let's finish some of that up on the other side here, because I know Josephus is another one that
Yes.
people have said there's interpolation, but even Habermas in his book, What is the Evidence for the Historical Jesus, he talks about interpolations, and even though there may be some there, but still the majority of the text is still is original. But we'll talk about that on the other side of the break. We'll be back in just 2 minutes.
Hey, thanks for listening to Grok Radio. Be sure to check out our website at ZYIWorldwide.com.
The Razor Swift is made possible by the generous support of our listeners. If you'd like to send a gift or a love offering, go to www.razorswift.com and become a partner today. Comments, questions, or suggestions can also be sent to us via our website, razorswift.com. Razor Swift, where the word is sharper than any two-edged sword.
Join Army Girl for Christ and Minister Grok as they tackle some of today's pressing issues from a Christian point of view on Truth Be Told, every Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. For more information, check out ZYIWorldwide.com.
You can now hear our program on Stitcher Smart Radio. Stitcher allows you to listen to your favorite shows directly from your iPhone, Android phone, Kindle Fire, and more. It's on demand and on the go. Don't have Stitcher? Download it free today at Stitcher.com or in the App Store. Stitcher Smart Radio, the smarter way to listen to radio.
Join Unituber and Army Girl for Christ as they discuss spiritual warfare, spiritual preparedness, the end times, life issues, and personal and spiritual growth. That's www.truthradionet.com, truthradionet.com.
And we are back. You are listening to The Razor Swift on Grok Radio. Today's guest is J. Warner Wallace. He's talking about his new book, Cold Case Christianity, and dealing with the resurrection of Christ. Now, Jim, you mind if I call you Jim or
yes,
Mr.
please.
Wallace?
No, I use Jay Warner only because there's Jim Wallace of Sojourners there in Washington, D.C. I know there's some confusion sometimes. Who is this Jim Wallace guy? So, Greg, when I first started working on the radio show, he would say, hey, it's probably going to be important for you to change your name. I thought, oh, that's great. So now I've got to change my name. But I actually think it is probably helpful for people to kind of distinguish between the two of us. So.
Okay, no problem. So, before the break, we were talking about, obviously, Tacitus, and what was it? Josephus was another one that was, when did he write his, Antiquities? I can't remember.
Of the Jews, yeah. Josephus, usually dating for Josephus is going to run anywhere from, 37 to 101 A.D., right in that, range, somewhere people are going to date. He's describing, for example, issues related to the destruction of the temple, so we know that these writings are going to come after 70 A.D. And so you look at some of the things that have been, here's the problem. You've got an ancient Jewish historian who writes Antiquities of the Jews, and in this a piece of manuscript, we've got some mention of both Jesus and the brother of Jesus in the text of Josephus's writing. And
would that
of course,
be James that he's
yes,
talking about?
and so you've got this great interest, right, in what does this ancient non-Christian report of Jesus say? And the problem, of course, is that Josephus's writings over the course of antiquity were often kind of collected by Christians, and there appear to be modifications that have been made to the most ancient of texts. So always, my interest, of course, is to try to get back to what is the earliest version. Do I have a version? Is there a version anywhere of the Josephus manuscript that we could have confidence is as clean as it can be, as free of corruption as it can possibly be? Now, I can tell you, I've looked at a couple of different sources. I try to find the most modest version of the Josephus passage related to Jesus. And I think that, when I've gone back and forth in my own mind, which do I think of the early versions that are out there, do I think is the most modest and therefore the most accurate? And where do I think I see, late insertions on the part of ancient Christians that would somehow corrupt the text? I ended up settling on an account that was published in 1971 by Shlomo Pines, who's this scholar of ancient languages. He was a professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and he published this long, previously lost 10th century Arabic text. Now, I wish I could tell you that I, dug this up on my own. I actually had a different version of the Josephus, very similar, but different version of the most ancient, and what I think is the truest version of the Josephus account in my book. And as I was showing the book and asking my friends to take a look at it, people like Greg Kokel, J.P. Moreland, Paul Copan, Craig Hazen at Biola, folks who I trusted would kind of look at my work and say, is there a better version of this out here? Well, Greg said he thought a better version of Josephus was this version from Shlomo Pines. So I went ahead and dug it up. And what it is, it's a 10th century Arabic text that was written by a Melkite bishop of Hierapolis who was named Agapius. And this leader, he was quoting Josephus in the original, in the Arabic language, which is unlike the Greek that was used by other authors from antiquity, see? And so it seems that overtly Christian references that you see in the other ancient Greek versions of this are missing from this quote. And that's why I think a number of scholars believe that this Arabic language quote of Josephus is actually probably closer to the original, or as close to the original as we can possibly find. And here's what it says about Jesus. This is, again, much less overt than some of the other sources you see that have been already corrupted by Christians. This quote says this: "At this time there was a wise man who was called Jesus. His conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. And those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he appeared or had appeared to them." And again, they're just saying that he had appeared to them, 3 days. Let me get back to my text here. 3 days after his crucifixion, and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders. So again, all Josephus is doing is kind of blandly reporting what the earliest believers believed. He's not making a conclusion about whether this is true or not. But even in this rather stripped version of the Josephus account, there's a lot of data. There's a lot of what I call reluctant admissions. And I see this all the time with suspects in cases where you'll ask them, did you do this crime? I think you did this crime. And you'd love them to just cop out to you, right? But they aren't going to do that. Instead, they make several reluctant admissions. No, I didn't rob that bank. Well, I've got video of you in the bank. And I don't really actually even have that, but I'll say that. And the suspect will say, well, I was making a deposit. Well, I know you wrote a demand note. I didn't write a demand note. I saw you writing on paper. I was just writing a deposit slip. So what you get is you'll get some reluctant admissions. He's in the bank at the time of the bank robbery. He's writing something on paper. Now, he may be explaining it in some other way, but he's giving you some important data. When you go to trial on this guy, he's not going to be able to deny he was in the bank at the time of the robbery because he's giving you that reluctant admission already. This is what some of the non-Christian sources will do. They are not going to give you an admission or even a statement that they saw something or believe something that the Christians saw or believed. Instead, they're going to reluctantly tell you something about either the earliest beliefs of these Christians, or try to explain something like Thallus trying to explain away the darkness at the crucifixion. He has to at least then inadvertently and reluctantly admit that Jesus apparently lived, was crucified, and there was darkness at the crucifixion that he's trying to explain naturally. So they give you these little pieces of information reluctantly that you can actually build a case about who Jesus was. And I try to do that in the book and give it the most cumulative view of Jesus from non-Christian sources.
Now, Jim, when you're getting information from non-believers and things that corroborate, I'll get that word out.
Yeah, no problem.
With the believers, isn't that what you call a hostile witness? And there's more weight behind that, right?
You'll definitely call that a hostile. But sometimes in court, when we say we've got a hostile witness, what we mean is we've got somebody who is really hostile to the attorney who's trying to get information from them. So you've got somebody who just doesn't want to cooperate, and you have to take that witness on as a hostile witness. It gives you the ability as a prosecutor to ask questions in a way which is far more similar to what the defense attorney can do. You can lead with your questions. You can do things that prosecutors typically can't do under direct examination if the judge is willing to declare that witness as a hostile witness. But I think you're right here. The idea is that you have non-believers who are hostile to the claims of Christianity, who are still, even in the midst of their hostility, giving you little pieces of data that if you could put them on a board, on a whiteboard, start writing them down. What does Tacitus say? What does Thallus say? What does Bar Serapion say? What does Phlegon say? All these sources, you can start to write down the little pieces they give you, and you get a puzzle that comes together that looks an awful lot like Jesus. And these are all people who would deny the claims of Christianity.
Now, here's another thing that I think is important for us to address with the Gospels when they were actually written. Now, I know you already touched on that earlier. I know some people want to say that the Gospels and really the New Testament as a whole was written hundreds of years after the fact. And of course,
Right.
You already addressed that because, the Gospels don't talk about the destruction of the temple in 70 A.D. So let's just say we go from the conservative position as Christians that, what's the earliest Gospels written in 40 AD, I believe?
Yeah, I think that there's, again, if all we had was one piece of evidence, you have to have direct evidence to have one piece of evidence be powerful enough to make your case. And we don't have a direct evidence case here. We have a circumstantial case. So therefore, we can't say, well, it's just because the temple's missing, that's a slam dunk. But when you put that together with the fact the siege of Jerusalem is also missing, the death of Paul is missing, the death of Peter is missing, the death of James, the brother of Jesus, is missing. There's internal evidence in the book of Acts, in Paul's letters, referring to Luke's Gospels that I think is powerful, that helps us put together a circumstantial case built on 6, 7, 8 pieces of evidence. And that's what we're trying to do in a chapter we just talked about. Do we think those Gospels were written early enough to have been written by people who were actually there? It doesn't mean it contains truth. It simply means those people were either there, and if nothing else, they're writing at a time in which the people who were there could test and verify what they were saying.
Right.
So that's powerful, I think.
They'd be able to knock it down since they were there
to
verify.
They can say, hey, this is
a
bunch of bunk. I mean, we were there. None of this happened. If it's written early enough, the only way to get around the lie, with this lie, is to write it so far away from the region that nobody. So I think looking at evidence that, number one, dates it early, and looking at evidence that, number two, shows that it is familiar with the region in which it lives are important.
Right.
Because they show us that this is a pretty tough lie to get away with, and I think that's another area that you can discuss too. Is just, could a conspiracy even be reasonable to begin with? So these are the kinds of things we try to look at.
Well, I think, wasn't it Habermas that said that if they were going to put up a conspiracy, the area of Jerusalem would be the last place you'd want to do it. You'd want to be far out somewhere else,
right. Well, and I think too, and most of the people who do are great historians, and I'm not a great historian. I'm not taught to that right now. I'm not. That's not my business. My business is working cold cases. But I can tell you this: I have worked conspiracies. But many of our homicides are done by more than one person, acting in unison, and they're holding on to a truth claim that I've got to then get to the truth. They're going to lie to me. They know what the truth is, but they're going to lie to me, and I've got to find a way to break the conspiracy before I can ever even take them to court. I've got to find a way to get them to tell the truth. And so I've learned what the successful attributes of conspiracies are. I try to give a list in the book of what makes a successful conspiracy. The problem, of course, with the Christian disciples, the apostles, is that they don't possess any of the characteristics that are required for a successful conspiracy. Look, we could say, is it possible? Well, I make a distinction in the book. Anything is possible. So, of course, you can say it's possible. It's just not reasonable given what's required for a successful conspiracy.
Well, let me ask this real quick, and I do want to get on to what you're talking about, the disciples and their case as far as eyewitnesses and if they have evidence of collusion and making up things. I started to talk about the Gospels being written decades after the fact. Why do you think it took so long for them to be written as a whole? And I know there was a credo. Was it in Corinthians? It goes back to, I think, 3 years after the death of Christ. I think that's the earliest credo in Christianity that's quoted. I can't remember exactly where, but you know what I'm talking about there.
Yeah, it's in 1 Corinthians 15. You do see an early statement on the part of Paul, which appears to reflect the earliest beliefs of those who witnessed the resurrection. But the real question is, and I had this question too, as a new believer, okay, look, why wouldn't you write this down immediately. Why wouldn't you be taking notes while Jesus is there? And I think there's a couple of reasons why you might not do it. I think the one, though, that is most evidential and supported by the evidence of the New Testament is that I do believe that these original eyewitnesses who saw Jesus, who listened to him, who followed him and devoted their lives to him, truly believed that he would return in their lifetime. And I think if you look at the kind of pleadings of Paul, if you look at the kinds of the writings of the New Testament authors, you see a theme that I think is pretty easy to kind of discern and to demonstrate in Scripture, that these folks believed that Jesus was going to return, and there wouldn't be a need to preserve this for the next generation. And so if that's the case, you simply transmit this orally, because that's, I always talk about what it looks like when you first get at a crime scene. I think Mark, I described it as a kind of the earliest transmission of the crime scene. You get this crime broadcast when the first officers get there at a robbery scene. They want to know, what's the guy look like, what was he driving, and what was the direction he fled in? Because what we're trying to do is get the minimal facts out, because we have a sense of urgency. We've got few minutes here to catch the bad guy as he's leaving. So we know that that's our goal. Let's get the minimal facts out to accomplish that end. And I think that the earliest descriptions of the crime scene then are the briefest. And they become more. Now, of course, once you broadcast that, you turn around and say, okay, tell me some more. So what was it, a suit he was wearing? Was it a suit and jacket? And you get more details. The next crime broadcast, just 15 minutes later, has got much more detail in it. And then, of course, the detective's report the next day is filled with detail. And you see the same kind of thing happening from Mark, say, to John, is that the earliest, most urgent information that you need to know about who Jesus is and what he did and what he said, that's there in Mark. That's the initial crime broadcast. It's got a sense of urgency about it. It's the most dramatic. It's the most emotional. It's the briefest action kind of version of the story. But as time goes by, these descriptions of the crime scene become more robust, more detailed, because you've got chances to go back and fill in the gaps. It's not as though the detective is now lying and filling in gaps that weren't there. It's just that his purpose a day later is different than the person at the crime scene who's giving the initial crime broadcast. And so I think you see that. And I think there's a sense of urgency. Now, of course, once you start to see that Stephen's been killed, James, the brother of John, has been killed. That's happening in the book of Acts. They've listed those deaths, but they don't list the deaths of Paul and Peter and James because they haven't been killed yet. They're still alive at the point of the book of Acts. But the point is, then you start to see those leaders of the church. Now, suddenly, it's urgent that Mark get the teaching of Peter written down on paper, papyrus, because we're seeing the death of the apostles. We're seeing the death of the first generation of eyewitnesses. And now I think you start to see at the end of that, it just so happens that I think we can date the early dating of the Gospels to about the end of the first lifespan of those eyewitnesses. And that's why I think we see it there, because there's a sense that we got to put this on papyrus.
Okay. Hey, real quick, I'm looking at the time here. It's 6 o'clock. We can extend for another 20, 30 minutes. Stick around for a little bit, or do you have to go? It's kind of up to you what you want to do with that. Well,
I'll stick with you. Let's just go a little bit more.
Sure. Yeah, because I definitely have some more questions. I want to cover some more of the theory. Now, we're talking about the disciples, and this is something we hear a lot. Would you die for a lie? And I know sometimes people try to compare the disciples dying for a lie versus, say, a Muslim dying for jihad or so-and-so dying for whatever. But obviously it's a non sequitur, because the disciples would know if it was a lie, whereas the Muslims don't know if what they are dying for really is going to happen.
Right.
Hope,
I think that.
Right?
Yeah, and I think you and I, we would say as Christians that we would die for our convictions. But we could be mistaken about our convictions, so we were not there to see these with our own eyes. We make the best inference we can from the evidence we have in front of us. But we don't have knowledge that this is a lie. And if you and I did have knowledge that this was a lie, then I think as soon as you start to apply pressure to the conspiracy, that's one of the factors you have to have in a successful conspiracy is low pressure. But if you start to apply pressure to a conspiracy, the people who know that they're lying typically will break because they don't want to have the negative consequence of the lie. And especially if you've got a large number. Again, that's another important factor in conspiracies is the lowest possible number of conspirators. But if I've got 10 conspirators, well then what are the odds that all 10 are going to be willing to make this crazy sacrifice for a lie? This is why you see the elements you typically see in a conspiracy to make them successful are absent in the Christian narrative. And I think that it is a difference between when you're saying, hey, would a believer, you and I, in the 21st century, if we died for this, it has zero evidential power in my view. Our desire to martyr ourselves for this truth has no power at all evidentially. But if the original eyewitnesses who would know if it was a lie or not are willing to die for what they say occurred, that I think does have evidential power because they're in the position to know.
Mm-hmm. So what's your thoughts about the swoon theory? And, I obviously just brought up Islam, and I think Muslims as a whole do subscribe to the swoon theory, being that Jesus survived his crucifixion. Or actually, I think their version is that someone was on the cross that it wasn't even Jesus. It was somebody else that maybe died or was made to look like he died or something. I don't remember exactly what they say, but...
I think that's one of the issues you look at. It's one of these possible explanations we talked about that are often given in addition to, of course, one of the possible explanations is just that he rose from the dead. But, of course, the natural explanations, we're going to deny that. And one of them is simply, well, maybe he didn't die. Maybe we're wrong about he was injured, but he didn't die at all. And so I describe it as the fact that maybe the disciples were simply wrong about Jesus' death. Now this has problems, I think, and I think part of the problem with the description, with the idea that he died, the people who the idea that he was just injured, people who make this claim typically would say, well, the Gospels are written by people who are trying to be honest. They were just mistaken. So we can trust the facts in the Gospels related to the crucifixion, they would say. We can trust what's being related. Even we might even go so far as to trust what the Gospel writers are saying about their resurrection sightings. But these poor Gospel writers were just wrong about him actually dying. They got that one fact wrong. Now, in order to kind of make this kind of a claim, the skeptic has to embrace lots of other details in the Scripture as though they're true. To say, well, I think he apparently got on the cross. He apparently was nailed to the cross. But when he came off the cross, he wasn't 100% dead. And then the resurrection accounts are simply a guy who came back. He basically resuscitated himself. He wasn't dead, so he's able to show himself to his followers. You see how much of the facts of the claims of the New Testament you have to accept as true in order to deny the one thing you're trying to deny, which is that he actually died on the cross. So I just want to make that point before I begin, because I think what happens here is that people read over the Scripture. You'll see one sentence in which it says that they took him off the cross and they wrapped him in the different anointing, the spices they would anoint the dead body with in order to prevent the decay and the smell of the dead body, and they would wrap him in the linens. All these things that you would do, it's all like in one sentence in the Gospels. But the reality is to get him off the cross, get him to the tomb, anoint him in a certain way, wrap him in a certain way, put you in steady contact with his body for an extended period of time. And I think when you do that, if you go to death scenes, you notice that there are certain things that happen once your heart stops pumping. Even the most primitive people group knows that if you want to check to see if someone's alive, the first thing you're going to check for is what? Breathing and pulse. It's like the old CPR courses, right? You check for breathing and pulse, and this has been going on for millennia. I mean, people have always checked for these. So you're saying that basically they have to get those two things wrong. And that then, when you see that when the heart stops beating, you see a dramatic loss of temperature, you see stiffness and rigidity, and you see what's called lividity, which is the settling of blood because there's no heart to pump the blood around. So it settles where gravity settles, and you see discoloration. So we got to be able to kind of argue that none of these things were observed. Apparently they missed all of this. This is the problem. I think that they didn't. The dead body feels very different than a living body that's unconscious. And I think that's part of the problem. I'm sure they were seeing the lividity, the rigidity, the loss of temperature, and so they didn't see all the signs of life you typically look for, and they were fooled for an extended period of time if this is in fact the case. And then you have a bigger problem too, I think, Rich. Remember, the account is not just that Jesus resurrected. It's that Jesus resurrected and continued to do miraculous events, miraculous displays of his power. You see it in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 1, verses 2 and 3. For 40 days he was giving many convincing proofs. And then at the end of all this, he ascends into heaven. So whoever it is that's coming back from this, it has to have the ability, if it's an imposter or if it's just the injured itinerant Jewish rabbi, apparently he has the ability to work miracles and ascend into heaven afterwards. So it's not as though this description of Jesus just kind of swooning on the cross and then coming back to life and feeling better eliminates the problem. That you still have a problem of the miraculous. It may not be a miraculous resurrection you've got to deal with, but now you still have to deal with the miraculous power and the ascension. So I think you've got some. I don't think that this answer really, it's got too many liabilities in my view, and I try to describe those in more detail in the book.
Well, I have a two-part question here about the Gospels being corrupted, or just really the Bible as a whole, but going specifically to the Gospels, because obviously that's where the meat of this is at. There are a number of people that say that, because there's so many different manuscripts and this and that, and I think total there's was there 20-some thousand or closer to 30,000 manuscripts, including the fragments and stuff. I don't remember the exact number, but
with fragments and all the other, remember we talk about fragments and we count them as one manuscript, but it could be a very, very small piece of fragment that we would count. So if you count the smallest of fragments up to complete manuscripts, it's over 24,000 that we have as of that figure was a figure that we were discussing with Dan Wallace, I think it was like April of this year. So I'm sure it's climbing every day. They're discovering fragments of every ancient text, from the Iliad and from other ancient writers to the Scriptures, every day. So the manuscript evidence is growing. But really, I think the skeptic's going to argue, well, yeah, it's fine. You got some fragment from the first century. Right now, the only fragment we typically talk about is the fragment of the Gospel of John from the first century, although there seems to be talk that there may be another fragment from Mark coming early next year.
Is that like P56 or P52
or
something?
If that's the case, we have another fragment coming, though the skeptic is still going to say it's just a fragment. So I think that we have to make a case for what I would call, the accuracy. And here's the description I typically use. If you've got a cold case that occurred 30 years ago, and now you've got a piece of evidence at the trial 30 years later, how do I know that piece of evidence was actually at the crime scene? How do I know somebody didn't drop that into the property 15 years after the fact, and that piece of evidence was never even part of the original case? Now I've got this bad piece of evidence that was put in many years later that now has to be assessed, and people are thinking it's actually part of the legitimate case. And people are going to argue this happens occasionally in cold cases. They even argue something similar happened in the O.J. case, right? This piece of evidence that was found in the house was not actually there from the beginning. It was dropped into that house by an investigator who placed it there. So this is the kind of claim you have to deal with, I think, with the Gospels as well. How do we know that what was written in the first century is the same thing we're holding today? How do we know somebody didn't come along in the 5th century and drop, or 3rd century, and drop the legend aspect of Jesus as a miracle worker who rose from the dead into the narrative when it was never there in the 1st century? They've basically evolved this Jesus guy into something he wasn't by corrupting the text sometime later. So what do we do to make sure we don't have evidence in our case that wasn't there? It's the same thing we're going to do to make sure we don't have a form of Jesus in our Bible that wasn't there in the original. And what we do is we call it the chain of custody. We simply look at, do we have any photographs of that piece of evidence at the crime scene? Did an officer pick it up, sign for it, sign it into property? Was it signed back out of property later by somebody else who brought it to the crime lab and signed it into the crime lab, and later on signed back out to another detective who signs it into the court? In other words, do we have a chain of custody where one person hands it to another, all the way down until it gets into court? Because if we do, we can take a picture of that piece of evidence at every point along the way and see if it's the same piece of evidence. Mm-hmm. And that's what we're going to do with the Scriptures. We know we have early observers. Let's say John is one of these in the Gospel of John, and he writes something about Jesus. Now, he's going to hand this off to somebody, the next police officer in the chain of custody. Who is that going to be? Well, we're looking for students of John. Let's take a look. Do we have any students we can identify? Well, Ignatius and Polycarp. Okay, Ignatius and Polycarp. What? Did they write anything? Did they take a Polaroid, a snapshot of the version of Jesus to show us what they learned? Because if they did, we can tell. Has the story started to change? Is there starting to be corruption? So we just did that. We just said, okay, who's the student of John? Ignatius Polycarp. Who's the student of Ignatius Polycarp? Irenaeus. Who's the student of Irenaeus? Hippolytus. And we keep on doing that all the way down from the earliest writer, John, to the courtroom. Sorry? Are you still there, Rich?
Yes. Yeah, can you hear me?
I can. So we try to do this from John all the way to the courtroom, which I would say in this case is probably that council where the canon of Scripture is affirmed for the first time, which that in my opinion is the well, that's not my opinion. The history records that's the Council of Laodicea in 363. So here we have a courtroom. And we're just going to try to form a chain of custody from the events to the courtroom. And I tried to do that several times in the book to show you that at every point in that chain of custody, when we take a snapshot, because, Ignatius and Polycarp, they wrote letters. And in their letters, they described the Jesus that was taught to them by John. Irenaeus wrote things, and he described the Jesus that was taught to him by Ignatius and Polycarp. Hippolytus wrote things, and he described the Jesus that was taught to him by Irenaeus. So we're able to see who is this Jesus guy, and is he changing over the years? And it turns out that in that chain of custody, the version of Jesus that most skeptics don't like, the guy who's a miracle worker who rose from the dead and claimed to be God, has not changed. He's the same Jesus back in the 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century, moving forward. The chain of custody, I think, is pretty powerful, and it makes sense. It's yet another piece of evidence that points to the early dating, because when you got Ignatius writing about Jesus in 110 A.D., where did he get that from? He got that from somebody who preceded him. So I think we've got to push the dating earlier and earlier in order to account for the source of these writings. And I think that's powerful.
Right. Another thing that I've heard, I don't remember where I heard this first, but that the Ante-Nicene Fathers, or the early Christian Fathers, as they're also known, which is 325 A.D. before that time period.
Council, right.
Exactly. They accounted for all but 11 of the verses of the New Testament. And then,
and I've actually got an article on Please Convince Me, in which I still have, I think, that claim on the article. I don't think that claim. The more I've tried my best, and I bought a bunch of sources, originals, and the most ancient sources I could get my hands on. This is as a layperson who's trying to find sources. I wanted to know, where did that statement come from?
Right.
Is that a true statement, first of all, that if you just assembled the writing of the early church fathers, that you would be able to assemble all the verses of the Bible with the exception of 11 verses? Now, give me a second here while I kind of look through I have some notes here on my computer.
Sure.
That always bothered me. I always wanted to know, is that actually is it true? And I don't think that's a claim that I would want to make anymore. I've seen it made. What I did, and Please Convince Me, was simply quote and give sources for where that comes from. But I can tell you that I think the more I look at that, that's too ambitious of a. But here's what I did do in Cold Case Christianity, is I took the letters of Ignatius and Polycarp, found the most austere versions of those letters possible, so we can make sure we have the versions of the letters that went to the churches that Polycarp and Ignatius were writing to. I also took a look at 1 Clement, the letter written by Clement, the student of Paul. These are
now,
very
is that
early.
Clement of Alexandria? No, that's Clement of Rome, right? Because there's two Clements, right?
That's right. Yes, it's of Rome, and he's usually described as either in a second or third position as Pope in Rome. Linus is the other disciple of both Clement and Linus are mentioned by Paul in his letters. But I took those letters, and I just mined out of those letters every description I could find of either Jesus' person. What do they think about Jesus? What have they been taught by their teachers about Jesus? And two, places where they mention some quote of Scripture that would give you a connection back to the original writers, the original eyewitnesses. And I did that because I felt like, hey, I want to see what's the picture. It's kind of like this idea that, hell, I could reassemble the entire Bible except for 11 verses from the writings of the church fathers. I just wanted to look at those three writers and what could I assemble of those three writers. And I think that when you look at that, it's pretty powerful. The version of Jesus that's offered by the first students of the eyewitnesses is identical to what the eyewitnesses themselves have written in the manuscripts that we have today, we know as the New Testament. That's what I thought was powerful. The snapshot in the chain of custody happens to match what we have in our hands today. So there's good reason to believe that we have an accurate reflection of what was being taught in the first century. And so that's what I was trying to do with this, is to look at it and say, hey, can we have confidence? And so while I think I wouldn't be so quick to say we can assemble all the New Testament except for 11 verses, I think I would say that what we can assemble from the second generation of believers who followed the disciples, we can assemble and have great confidence in what the disciples taught and what we see in our Bibles today because it matches what those first generation of students wrote about.
Hey, Jim, we have about 10 minutes left in the show here. Do you mind if I take some callers? I'll give out the call-in line and see if anyone wants to ask you any questions.
Yeah, that would be great. Sure.
Okay, cool.
Let me just, while we're still waiting for that, if you have a second, I can tell you, I did find in my notes here, it was Sir David Dalrymple. He wrote and worked right around 1726 to 1792. He was a Scottish judge. He was a historian. He wrote 3 early volumes on Christian church history, which I purchased all 3, and they're called The Remains of Christian Antiquity. Now, he's supposed to be an expert in the writings of the early church, and he was the one who allegedly said, as I possessed all the existing works of the fathers of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, I commenced to search, and up to this time I have found the entire New Testament except 11 verses. That's quoted all over the Internet, right? And that's where it comes from. Well, I've purchased all 3 of those books, and I cannot find that anywhere. I cannot find any reference to this work that was done in which he's searching through. So at this point, I'm much more confident in what we did in Cold Case Christianity than I am in that quote from him. So,
okay, yeah, I'm glad that I asked you that because I've used that a number of times, and I don't want to disseminate information that's incorrect. God forbid.
Yeah, I think our case is so good, Rich, I don't think we need to go to, kind of the lore that you find, on, I mean, I'm sure that people have written about this and put this in their books, but for me, we have enough information, enough confirmation in just the writing of those 3 church fathers I mentioned that we don't even need to go to say, I've got all but 11 verses. Look, the version of Jesus that you and I need to know about, we know that that's confirmed in the writing of those 3 authors.
Right.
Ignatius, Polycarp, and Clement. Do we know, was it 5,000 or 4,999 who were fed by the, the details may be absent. They're missing because not everything is repeated. But what we do see is confirmation of what the essential truth about Jesus was.
Well, Jim, in those 5,000, how many of those were babies? That's what I want to know.
Well, exactly. What is the tradition of the authors, right, to say, hey, do we mention the women? Is this just men? Of course, a lot's been written about that, too, so we want to try to go into all those details, right?
Okay, let me give out this call-in number here real quick, and I have a few more questions for you. If you'd like to call in and ask Jim a question, the number is 714-242-5180. Once again, it's 714-242-5180. Now, with your book, actually, have you read Simon Greenleaf's book from the late 1800s?
Yeah, I bought it on Kindle, and I started to collect, some of the Robert Anderson, some of the folks who have either a law background or a criminal background or an investigative background to see what kinds of things have been done. And what approaches have been taken, and so what I've learned in this so far, Rich, is that each one of us has some life experience that we can bring to the table to talk about the evidence, or talk about our journey, talk about what it is that was compelling for us, why we became Christians. And you can go out and get a PhD in something that will make you an expert in something. And for me, I have to bring to the table what limited skill set, what limited tool set I can bring. I try to bring it modestly. I'm not a historian. I'm just an investigator. But there are certain principles of evidence I can probably describe. And I think that people like Greenleaf and people like Anderson who wrote about these, they take an investigative approach, right? Or kind of a legalistic, or not a legalistic, but a legal-minded approach to the evidence. And that's kind of what I try to bring too. And so the work you're going to get from me in Cold Case Christianity is much more akin to the kinds of stuff. Well, a lot of our shows have been on Dateline. People are familiar with these kinds of cases because they see them on TV all the time. And that's what's so great about just taking these principles everyone's already familiar with, they've watched them on TV, and applying them to the Gospels.
I'm gonna throw you a curveball here real quick, and I know this really doesn't matter either which way. It's just kind of neat if it is real. But and one of the reasons why I'm bringing it up also is because I'm having, you know who Barry Schwartz is? Barry M. Schwartz?
I don't.
He's
I'm sorry to say.
First I'll ask you the question, and maybe you've heard of him and his team. What's your thoughts about the Shroud of Turin? That's my question. But Barry Schwartz was a photographer that was on the Stirrup team. That his team has done more forensics investigation and stuff on the Shroud than any team in history, scientifically speaking. And he's going to be on the show in 2 weeks. Of course, with what you are doing with what's your thoughts about that? I mean, I've seen so many different things for and against. It's kind of...
I have too, and I can tell you I've got good friends who are apologists who seem to look at the shroud very favorably. I'm still skeptical. I'm kind of sitting on the middle. I'm on the fence, and let me tell you what that does for me. If I've got a case and I've got 30 pieces of evidence, and these 30 pieces of evidence all seem to point to the same conclusion, but 5 of them are less demonstrable. 5 of them are maybe even open to broader interpretations. It turns out those 5 pieces actually are good pieces. They point to the same conclusion that's true. They actually were caused by the defendant, but because they're broader and open to interpretation, I'll sometimes build my case with just the 25 that I think are irrefutable. The 25 that I think are so solid that the defense is going to have a hard time working around. Why would I want them? Why would I want to pitch something across the plate really slow so they can just hammer it out of the park? Because although they may have made a point on that one piece, I don't want my jury to construe then that all my other pieces are all equally soft. So what I try to do is make a case with the strongest pieces of evidence I have in the courtroom. And although I may have more pieces, I don't bring everything I could, and by the way, either does the defense. We all try to find those pieces. Now, I do not believe we ever should take a piece that could help the other side and hide. As a matter of fact, I always make those pieces part of my case because I don't want to be seen or interpreted as hiding a bad piece of evidence, right, or some piece of evidence that points to a different conclusion. But what I'm saying is, in any case you ever put together, some pieces will be better than others. And I would want to lean on the ones that are the best rather than the ones that are open to debate or open to more debate. I may mention them tangentially, but I would never say my case is built on that. And this is probably one of those kinds of, it's interesting to me. It has some limited value, but I would never make it the centerpiece of my case because I think it's got too broad of an interpretation still, that all the facts aren't in yet. I still have some questions myself. I don't see it as maybe being as strong as other pieces that I would present in this case for Christ. So I think I'm more likely to leave that to the side. I may mention it, but I wouldn't stand behind it. I wouldn't make it the foundation of my case. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have just a couple minutes left. How do we, if a person wants to pick up your book, what would be the best way for them to get it?
Well, and the great thing about I was able to publish with David C. Cook, which is a very well-known Christian publisher, which is a nonprofit. So what's great about their approach to doing publication, they're basically a ministry that uses publications to fund the ministry, the global ministry they're doing around the world. So I love the fact that that's the kind of publisher I get to work with because that's always been, as a skeptic, that was the thing I was always most concerned about. I thought, I don't even trust these Christians because they're always somebody who's trying to make a buck. They're always on TV selling something or asking them to send money, and it used to always bother me as a non-Christian. Now, of course, today I understand that the worker deserves his wages. I have no problem with that. But I'm skeptical in that regard still. So I love the fact I was able to join with however people buy the book, great. If you want to go on Amazon, it's on Barnes & Noble. It's at every major bookstore now, every major bookseller. It's in pretty much every format you can get it in, Kindle, Nook, audio. It's in paperback. I mean, the idea here is to make this available to people in every possible format. And where they get it, of course, my site is coldcasechristianity.com, and all I do there is link to the major booksellers who are stocking the book. So I think anywhere you go to get it, if you're a Barnes & Noble person, go to Barnes & Noble. I'm sure it's right down at the local bookstore as well. So any way you want to get it that way, but you can get it through the link on our website at coldcasechristianity.com.
Okay, and your contact information is on there as well if someone
Yes, and I write a blog every
questions.
day during the week, and we try to talk about evidential issues. I try to put a blog up every day.
And what's the name of your podcast again?
Well, we started our website years ago called PleaseConvinceMe.com, and I still host that site, and a bunch of other investigators, a couple of cops, a district attorney, all blog on that site and write articles for that site. So it's a kind of a law enforcement-minded apologetics website, and it still exists. We still post blogs on it daily. We have a podcast that I do once a week that we host there. It's called the Please Convince Me podcast, and I want you to know that I am joining with Stand to Reason. I'll be part of the Stand to Reason staff on January 1st.
Oh, excellent.
So part of the 4 speakers there, Greg Kokel, of course, Brett Kunkel, Alan Schliemann, and myself will be the 4 speakers who work through Stand to Reason. So the podcast is now what we call the Stand to Reason Please Convince Me podcast, but we'll still be podcasting once a week.
Hey, by the way, on a side note, I heard her talking in my ear. She told me 60 seconds.
Okay, got it.
I just want to say to you, congratulations. Your son recently made it through the academy that I read. That
Yes. He's now a police officer and off probation, and then it's about a year and a half of work to get to that point, and now he is a full-fledged. So I feel like I can leave, and I'll be leaving next month. And I can, I still have some hands on the department. I still have a kind of a view of the department through my own son. So it's been great to see him join the force. Yeah.
Must be a proud pappy.
Well, yeah, we're 3 generations, 3 guys named Jim Wallace who have all worked at the same agency for the last 50 years, and now for another 30 going forward. So.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on, Jim. It was a pleasure to have you on, and I've really been anticipating having you on. I know we've been talking on and off through Facebook and stuff. And
yeah, it's been really. I've been feeling the same way, and I'm glad we got a chance to connect. And my schedule's getting busier, and I know yours is too. So I'm just grateful for the opportunity.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. You have a good night, sir.
You too. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay, folks, we are out of time. Thank you for listening to The Razor Swift. We will have a show next Wednesday at 5 p.m. Pacific. Mike Martinez, a former Jehovah's Witness, will be sharing his testimony and how he got out of the watchtower. Have a good night, everyone. Each time that you take me, I'll get